Fatigue and pacing in team sport, a review of current evidence. Team sport is characterised by intermittent periods of high and low intensity activity. It is therefore important to understand how players regulate their activity across the duration of a match and identify if fluctuations in activity intensity are a factor of fatigue or pacing. The purpose of this review is therefore threefold. Examine the literature relating to fatigue, identify contemporary models of endurance performance, and relate these to the context of team sport. Our search strategy included looking at key terms for endurance, team sport, intermittent running, fatigue, and time motion analysis. We first had to look at our background research and define fatigue. We needed to look at exercise limitations for both submaximal and maximal exercise, understand perception of effort and how these are generated, and then we needed to look at complex models of fatigue. To contextualise this, we needed to understand what the characteristics of team sport are and how is physical performance in team sport quantified. We used time motion analysis and activity profiles to do this. Historically, fatigue was defined as a reduction in output to complete a task. However, current concepts identified increased perceptions of effort prior to the cessation of exercise task to exhaustion. Contemporary models therefore suggest both physical and psychological aspects are included. With the current definition, acute impairment of performance that includes both an increase in perceived effort required to produce a desired force and eventually the inability to produce this force. So limitations to exercise performance relate to changes in either the central and peripheral systems, which is performance fatigability, or the psychological state of the athlete, or perceived fatigability. So we needed to look at some of the fatigue-induced limitations to exercise. By doing this, we had to come up with we had to look at a few different models. We identified the cardiovascular anaerobic model of fatigue, where supply of oxygen or the removal of metabolic waste products are limited during exercise. We looked at the supply and demand model of fatigue, where the supply of adenosine triphosphate via various metabolic pathways or through substrate depletion. We looked at central and peripheral limitations, whereby the muscle recruitment process or the excitation contraction coupling process are disrupted. We looked at biomechanical limitations, where economy and efficiency of an exercise task is impaired. And then we looked at the psychological or motivational theory for exercise limitations, which is a lack of motivation to achieve an exercise task at a given intensity. And this starts to incorporate the brain into performance model. However, all these models are task dependent and therefore a complex model must exist. For the purpose of this review, we identified three complex models: feedback inhibition, the central governor theory, and psychobiological model of endurance performance. The inhibitory feedback model is based on peripheral and central limitations to exercise performance. Peripheral fatigue is sought to increase discharge properties of group 3 and 4 afferents via contraction-induced mechanical and chemical stimuli. Once a threshold level of peripheral feedback is achieved, whereby exercising further becomes painful, there is reduction in central motor drive by inhibition of the central nervous system. The inhibitory feedback model therefore works to protect the muscle from further homeostatic disruption and is based on afferent peripheral feedback. The central governor model takes this a little bit further and recognises the brain has a principal role in the regulation of exercise intensity. It's based on telo-anticipation theory, whereby to complete an exercise task without catastrophic homeostatic disruption, such as myocardial ischemia, a feedback control must exist. Subconscious control through feed-forward mechanisms, which is reducing central motor drive, are based on perceptions of fatigue. The model suggests that increased familiarity and certainty of the endpoint during an exercise task improves performance by allowing athletes to maintain a greater level of psychophysical stress. This is often referred to as the end-spurt phenomena, normally associated with world records or highly competitive situations, whereby even under high levels of metabolic stress, the theory suggests an increase in pace would not be catastrophic. Furthermore, there is a suggestion that an exercise reserve must exist, as muscle is never fully recruited during submaximal tasks and may explain the end spurt phenomena. Just to recap, the central governor theory is a protective subconscious feed-forward control based on afferent sensory feedback, which is interpreted by the brain as fatigue. One of the more contemporary models that we came across was the psychobiological model of endurance performance. This is an effort-based decision-making model and is based on the motivational theory. Its principle is through 5 cognitive or motivational factors: perception of effort, potential motivation, knowledge of the distance and time to cover, knowledge of the distance or time remaining, previous experience of the perceptions of effort during exercise at varying intensities and durations. The model suggests that an increase in exercise tolerance is when motivation is increased, such as there's competitor present, or by a reduction in perceptions of effort. The model also suggests that the conscious awareness of perceived effort, or how hard, heavy or strenuous the exercise task is a key component for regulating exercise intensity. And just to recap on this one, the psychobiological model of fatigue or endurance performance is a conscious decision-making process based on perceptions of effort or motivation. So once we identified our limitations to exercise, and then we looked at these complex models, we had to contextualize this for team sport. So we needed to understand what environment we are looking at. So team sport is characterized by periods of low and high intensity activity and are commonly quantified through time motion analysis. There is a general decline in high intensity running volume across a match and is thought to be a factor of fatigue or strategic, such as the player pacing. Despite these declines, players are still able to reach peak speeds across the duration of a match. We know activity profiles are influenced by many external factors. However, across the literature there are 2 distinct stages during a game whereby a negative impact on running performance is observed. This is following a period of intensified competition during the match and directly following the match. Both these situations are temporary. However, following a match, the return to baseline values take much longer, and therefore these are distinct. Conversely, following a period of intensified competition during a match, running intensity returned following a brief period of lower intensity activity. A complex interaction between mechanisms that regulate exercise intensity must exist in intermittent team sport athletes, as many task-specific limitations have been reported in the literature, such as metabolic flux, substrate depletion, excitation, contraction, disruption, dehydration, acidosis, and adenosine triphosphate depletion. We aim to therefore identify first how is intermittent running performance influenced, and then look at how this fits our model of performance. Intermittent running performance and physical qualities. Physical qualities are important factors in differentiating levels of athletic prowess. A strong relationship exists between physical capacities and activity profiles during a match, with both aerobic and anaerobic contributions important. Training physical qualities is therefore an important component of athletic development, with improved rates of phosphocreatine resynthesis, glycolytic enzyme activity, oxygen diffusion, and reduced metabolic disturbance reported following exposure to training interventions. Furthermore, recently, changes to physical qualities have been shown to influence self-regulated running performance in team sport athletes. Following 4 weeks of intermittent hypoxic training, athletes were able to accumulate greater low-intensity running volume during a self-regulated running performance test. Therefore, one of the key take-home points here is that physical qualities have an influence on self-regulated running performance in team sport athletes. Intermittent running performance and environmental stress. Running performance during competition has been shown to be influenced by environmental stress. High ambient temperatures cause a whole game reduction in total running distance covered. However, high intensity activity is unaffected. When we looked further into this study, we found that core body temperature had a positive relationship with high intensity running distance and a negative relationship with low intensity activity. Hot ambient environments have been shown to accelerate catecholamine production, cause dehydration, increase core body temperature, and decrease exercise performance. However, no difference was observed between high intensity running, very high intensity running, distance covered, or vertical jump following a match when compared to matches played in cooler environments. Interesting, core temperature peaked in the first quarter during the match and then stabilised. So key point here is that it suggests that team sport athletes regulate low intensity activity once a critical threshold of core temperature is reached to maintain high intensity activity in hot environments. Intermittent running performance and mental fatigue. Definition of fatigue highlights the need to understand both physical stress and psychological stress and how these impact performance. Mental fatigue is a psychological state and has been shown to influence exercise performance. However, it has limited effects on maximal exercise intensity, although in isolation, submaximal exercise has been shown to be effective. When we expand this, during whole body exercise, under mental fatigue conditions, players cease a physical capacity test at an early stage despite no physiological differences observed and with similar RPE reported. So key point here is that mental fatigue is thought to limit exercise performance by increasing the perceptions of effort for a given task and highlights perceived effort is an important regulator for exercise tolerance. Intermittent running performance and deception or masking of the task endpoint. The regulation of exercise intensity is thought to be a way of improving performance or reducing fatigue. Observing team sport athletes during a game situation gives the greatest understanding of how pacing or fatigue influence activity profiles. The use of small-sided games is such a method to observe pacing and fatigue with control over certain variables. When the athlete knows the endpoint of the exercise task, there is a distinct activity profile. However, when masked or deceived of the exercise endpoint, the athlete will select a conservative speed or regulate pace once the endpoint becomes apparent. This is important as it identifies that the regulation of exercise intensity is a conscious decision-making process. Just to summarise, physical qualities have an effect on low-intensity activity during self-regulated intermittent running and therefore have an effect on pacing strategy. Players regulate low-intensity activity to maintain high-intensity activity once a critical level of peripheral feedback is achieved, such as core temperature. Players regulate exercise intensity based on perceptions of effort. Once the effort to maintain the task is greater than the effort that the athlete is willing to exert, the task is ceased. Exercise tasks are regulated as a conscious behaviour. When the athlete is masked or deceived of the exercise endpoint, a decision is made to be conservative or adjust the pace based on the context of the scenario. Summary. This model of performance best suits the psychobiological model of endurance performance. However, it is not conclusive. Implications for practice. Developing players' physical qualities is important for injury prevention and conditioning. However, it may also be important for developing their pacing strategy. Monitoring mental fatigue or training under mental fatigue may be advantageous to maximise the performance outcome. When prescribing exercise, it may be useful to mask, deceive, and have knowledge of the exercise endpoint. Directions for further study. Do physical qualities have an effect on pacing strategy? If so, which physical qualities give us the biggest impact? Is it possible to change an athlete's pacing strategy? Can we manipulate perceived effort to alter the pacing strategy? And what effect does diet and supplementation have on pacing strategy in team sport athletes? If physical qualities can affect pacing strategy, it may be plausible to suggest certain nutritional interventions may also have equally an effect on pacing strategy.